ready for the last two chapters? Chapter 31, An Ugly Moment. Someone hurtled down the road from the Royal Victoria Hotel, going so fast on the hill that he staggered a little. Another someone chased him, the beam of a torch bouncing from cobbles to tree branches with every pump of his arms. It was Leonard who ran in front. We could see him now, hair flying with a scratched face and wild eyes. I shivered and shrank behind Belle. "Hold up!" It was Constable Beck who chased Leonard. "You! Stop!" Hector leapt directly into Leonard's path and raised his hands as if to snatch him. I saw the look on Leonard's face as he nimbly swerved out of the way. He was fueled by demons, and no mere boy would thwart his escape. I jumped from the shadows and thrust out a large Wellington boot. Leonard tumbled, grunting, to the ground, so she tripped him up with one of the big boots that she'd just put on, right? Constable Beck thundered up and threw himself upon his quarry. Runner and captor lay panting in a heap. Leonard's mouth twisted in pain. I had to remind myself that he did not deserve pity. And yet, why did my heart feel sore? A friend had turned out to not be a friend. He'd locked me in a leaking vessel on an icy sea and not heeded my cries for help. "Bravo, Aggie!" Hector's normally sleek hair was ruffled and his pale cheeks flushed. "Bravo to you," I said. "You sent him my way. An action hero after all." "Man down!" cried Constable Beck. Leonard squirmed and kicked, but the policeman was bigger and kept him pinned. Two more officers leapt forward, letting Constable Beck roll out of the way as they yanked Leonard to his feet and gripped him tightly between them. I could not bear to watch and yet could not look away. The demon of a few minutes ago was gone. It was a boy I saw now, with a bruised face and a bloodied nose. A boy who tended flowers and did magic tricks and fed Tony nubs of sausage. A boy who had killed a woman in most horrible fashion. "I'm sorry, Miss Aggie. It all went wrong." I could scarcely hear his voice. "I wanted her to get sick, that's all, to stop her calling the coppers on me. I was going to talk to Miss Rose, only then it was too late. She was telling me lies and I got mad. I didn't mean—" He tried to wipe his bloody nose on his shoulder, but the constables held him too tightly. "I didn't want to hurt you, only—" "Only you did," I said. "And Rose, too. You hurt everyone, Leonard." He took in hollow-sounding breath and began to cry. Inspector Locke dug in the pockets of his coat for a pair of handcuffs and snapped them into place. Leonard yelped as the metal at his wrist was used to pull him away. His teary eyes met mine for one moment more, but I thought only of Rose, lying on the stretcher. The officers shoved Leonard into the police wagon and climbed in to flank him. Hector's hand found mine, a small, warm comfort in the wet A small, warm comfort in the wet, black night. "Constable Beck," the inspector clapped the young officer's shoulder, "I commend you heartily for your courage and speed. You've run the villain to ground." Constable's left eye was swollen nearly shut, his face sweaty and smeared with dirt. He saluted, "Sir!" As soon as the inspector turned away, I saw Beck grin like a birthday boy. "Constable Beck," I said. He smiled crookedly beneath his puffy eye. "You have broken a promise," he said. "Last evening, you vowed to leave policing to the police. But here you are again, wandering about in the dark, improperly dressed and jumping into the path of wanted criminals, for which I most heartily thank you," he said. "I don't think it'll happen again," I told him. Constable Beck offered his hand. I shook it, and so did Hector. We shared a look, Hector and I. After all our deductions and daring and drenchings, it did not seem quite fair that Constable Beck should be the only hero. I suppose that being children we were overlooked, though. I felt we deserved small medals at the very least. I do too, don't you? Nonetheless, we gave a good show of congratulations, for we were mightily relieved to have the escapade at its end. I wished suddenly with all my heart to be tucked into my bed with Charlotte bringing me a cup of hot milk and Tony snuffling at my feet. How would I get home? And what about Hector? Had the charitable Mrs. Teasdale even noticed that our little immigrant was not inside the vicarage? The hoofbeats and wheel rumble of another vehicle came up the road from town, a lantern swaying wildly from the driver's seat. "Hello?" A woman's voice. "Hello?" The person holding the reins was struggling to keep the horse moving uphill in a steady line. Good heavens, Mummy! Darling one! I recognized Star Lady, the horse belonging to old Mr. Herman, who lived 2 houses along on Bertram Road. Next to Mummy on the wagon seat was Charlotte, holding the lantern aloft and looking positively white with fear. Whoa! Mummy pulled so sharply on the reins that she and Charlotte were jolted backward with a sudden stop. Your mother is a new driver? Asked Hector. She has scarcely left our house since Papa died. I said I've never seen her drive a horse. My mummy had done it. After an evening of ever-growing anxiety, with Granny Jane and Charlotte stoking the fire and pacing the drawing rooms in turns, Groveland had received a dire telephone call from Roddy Fusswell at the Royal Victoria Hotel. I needn't relate all the ruckus that followed, said Mummy, because all's well that ends well. I drove the cart myself, and here you are, Sweet Pea, safe and sound. Come along, we'll have you home in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. But Hector, too, for heaven's sake, he'll stay with us. We left word at the vicarage on the way here. Up you get. Oh, that didn't make sense at first. Up you get. Sally will have the fires blazing by the time we get home. Despite Mummy's feat in driving all the way here, Inspector Locke asked for a volunteer from the constabulary to manage the return journey. Constable Beck hastily shot up his arm and had his foot on the carriage step in an instant. Another officer would follow us with Belle. I knew that Charlotte's face was as pink as raspberry pudding, though it was too dark to see anything really. Oh, Charlotte, whispered the handsome constable, pushing her hat askew with his head. Oh, Morris, she murmured in return. I think that we met because a kindly confectioner tumbled to the floor. Oh, that's from the very beginning. I guess Aggie's kind of like remembering the beginning. Even Aggie helped us along, said Morris. Her behavior allowed us to meet more than once. Yes, sighed Charlotte. All is forgiven. Not funny. Hector and I sat under a fur rug on either side of Mummy, leaning in for warmth. We both were lulled to sleep before ever arriving at Groveland, and learned at breakfast that we'd been carried inside by Constable Beck. They were exhausted, weren't they? Okay, boys and girls. It is quite late. Miss Bell should be in bed. I look quite the fright, so you cannot comment on how I look. However, considering it is the last chapter of the book, if I did not have this ready to go tomorrow morning and get posted, I think I might get strangled by several children in this class. So I think it's best, in order for me to sleep well tonight, knowing that I won't be strangled by my students tomorrow, that I go ahead and finish reading the book. Wouldn't you agree? So, let's see here. Oh, where were we? Wow, I read this earlier today and it seems like years ago. Okay. Remember? Okay. They were just being taken back in the cart by Constable Beck, and she and Hector had sat under a fur rug, all snuggled up against a mummy, and she said the next thing they knew, it was breakfast time, because they had gone home and been carried to bed by Constable Beck and didn't remember a thing. Have you ever done that? I used to do that when I was a child. We lived in Kentucky, and my grandparents were in Nashville, Tennessee, and that was like 2.5 hours away. And I would go to sleep on the way home on a Sunday night, and then I'd wake up the next morning. It's like magically Monday. How did that happen? You have your pajamas on, everything. Like, how does that happen? Parents make that happen. I don't know how they do it, but they do. Okay, so it actually switches to a clipping from the Torquay Voice. Okay, the article is titled, Villain Apprehended in Mermaid Room Murder. Second Victim Threatened in Bathing Cove Drama, by Augusta C. Fibley. Well, Abby? Oh, my pities. Wow, really? Yeah, I have to show you, because now that I've made a big fuss out of it. Do you see that? Upside down, with great pomp and circumstance, as if she wanted to make sure I knew she did not appreciate me reading and waking her up. Focus, Miss Bouse. See what happens when I try to read late? The greatest excitement was occasioned late on Tuesday at the Ladies' Bathing Cove near Torquay Harbor. From careful inquiries pursued by this reporter, we are able to present many authentic particulars for the edification of our readers. Ooh, such fancy words. This commotion displaces the arrest Really? Do we need another interruption? Seriously? Get down. Don't get yourself all choked. That's what happens when you lay upside down. See, you can't do that. You're too old. She's making her way up now. Very annoyed at me. Okay, let's try again. This commotion displaces the arrest yesterday of the pitiful lady who was confined in error for many hours. Ms. Mary Ann Eversham has been released and returned to her residence on Bertram Road. Thank goodness. As rumors have declared throughout the town, the Mermaid Room killer has indeed been apprehended. His name is Leonard Cable, and a more heartless fiend has rarely been encountered. He is recently arrived in Torquay, employed as a gardener, and not well known in the village, though he impressed some with his comely appearance and steady work habits. But Leonard Cable was all deceit. Not content with the cunning murder by poison of Mrs. Irma Eversham, Cable yesterday evening abducted her daughter, Miss Rose Eversham, and removed her to the isolation of Cove Beach with harmful intent. There he revealed his purpose and the grievous error of his motive. Believing Rose Eversham to be his sister and Irma Eversham their shared mother, Leonard Cable was driven by greed, expecting to inherit some portion of the late Captain Eversham's fortune. Alas, his heinous actions were founded on a deluded relationship and caused nothing but harm and sorrow. Miss Rose was insensible upon arrival at the hospital, but had rallied by morning. Despite a lump on her head and cruel bruising to her neck and shoulders where the villain clutched and shook her in his frenzy. She will not be disfigured by her misadventure. Also injured in the evening's incident was Miss Agatha Morton, the 12-year-old dance student who discovered the body of Mrs. Irma Eversham last Saturday morning. Wow, it's only been a week. Ms. Morton's persistence in asking questions resulted in cracking open the investigation, alas, too late for Rose Eversham's safety. The intrepid child pursued the killer and his hapless victim through the foggy night and was trapped in a sea-soaked bathing hut by the pitiless Mr. Cable. Belgian visitor Hector Perot also played a part in rallying assistance from the constabulary. She's doing a good job giving them credit, isn't she? 6 officers of the law, under the direction of Inspector H. Locke, were involved in the rescue of Miss Rose Eversham and in the subsequent pursuit of the crafty criminal. Receiving special commendation was Constable Morris Beck, who tackled the monster to the ground and held him until other officers could assist in the arrest. The prisoner betrayed much agitation about his person when removed into custody. His step was unsteady as he approached the bar, his clothing disheveled, and his countenance that of a savage. Mr. Abelman, Justice of the Peace, addressed the prisoner. You stand committed to Darmoor Prison to take your trial for willful murder. The prisoner was then removed from the bar. I think they mean courtroom. I think that's their word for that. In response to a question put forth by this reporter in the courthouse corridor, the suspect said, "It was all a mistake. I'm so very sorry." Perhaps remorse is valued in the eyes of God, but it offers little comfort to Irma Eversham or her family. Chapter 32. A final explanation. A very pale Rose sat in Papa's chair. An embroidered scarf around her neck covered what I imagined, even 6 days later, to be livid marks of a brutal attack. Violet shadows of a cruel encounter, smears of berry juice upon an ivory tea cloth, splashings of blood on a snowy field. She really needs to stop doing that. Outside the windows, a bruise-colored sky turned from twilight to autumn night. Earlier, Tony and I had rolled my hoop in the drive and felt the snap of coming winter. Here in the drawing room, the fire was roaring. Best of all, Marjorie had come home for a few days to see for herself that all of us were safe and sound. She sat beside Rose on the ottoman and me nestled under her arm, and Tony splayed on the carpet before us. Mummy was here, Granny Jane and Charlotte, and also Hector. I'm glad they finally accepted Hector into the family, right? Miss Mary Ann remained at home in bed with a dreadful chest cold, result of her ordeal in the dungeon. She may have been coughing, but I believed her malady went deeper still, that her heart had been cracked right down the middle and then again crosswise. Poor Miss Mary Ann had lost her sweetheart, her brother, and her son for the second time. She lost her sister-in-law, which was perhaps not the greatest sorrow, but they'd been related for half a lifetime, and that must count for something. Not least of all, Miss Mary Ann had nearly lost her beloved Rose. The folly of The folly of Leonard's single error, approaching the wrong woman as his mother, had unwrapped headache for all of us. Such weight as Miss Mary Ann's chest might easily be mistaken for bronchitis. So she thinks Miss Mary Ann is more heartbroken than she is sick. Because that's her son that actually committed the murder and tried to kill Rose and Aggie, right? Can you imagine how dreadful that would feel? This was my first encounter with Rose since the awful vision on the stretcher. I longed to ask 1,000 questions, but knew it was kinder to let her tell the tale in her own time. Hector I'd seen every day. As soon as school was finished, he came straight to Groveland and worked on his assignments while I read beside him at the library table. Granny Jane and Mummy agreed that he was quite the most polite boy they'd ever met, and excellent advertising for befriending a foreigner. He hopped up now to hold open the door for Sally, coming with the heavily laden tea trolley. Pea soup with buttery croutons, a giant wedge of cheddar, and honey for dipping it in. Ham sandwiches with cress from the greenhouse picked by Mummy. Cook says to remind you, Miss Aggie, there's, alas, no blackberries this time of year, but she's done an apple, since you made such a noise about pie. Next to the pie were ramekins of chocolate pudding and a plate of bourbon biscuits. Tony went begging from one knee to the next, though he was scolded often. I was not the only one to succumb, which means that Mummy probably kept telling him no, and everybody else kept feeding him under the table. Sounds like my house. Cook also knew now that Hector preferred drinking what he called chocolate instead of tea. Chocolat was my name for it, really just cocoa, but twice as thick. I suppose they never have sweets at the vicarage, I poked Hector, the way you're tucking in. How is the old Reverend Teabag? Said Marjorie. Hector licked his spoon. The minister is at all times kindly, but his wife, she thinks I am deaf. Also, she is most untidy. Oh, heavens, said Mummy. If tidiness is your ideal, you've got the wrong friend in Aggie. I am not untidy, I objected. I merely surround myself with a plethora of possibilities. I love that word plethora. You must learn the word plethora, especially if you're a writer. P-L-E-T-H-O-R-A. It means an unending amount, a wide, numerous variety with a plethora of possibilities. It's an awesome word. Granny Jane was alone in her laughter, but that was enough for me. Well, Rose, said Marjorie when Sally had wheeled away the tea things, will you tell us about your darkest hour, or is it too much to dwell on the idea that Leonard wanted you dead? I do not think you wish me dead, Rose said slowly. Her voice was weak, as if she were recovering from an ailment of the tonsils. What he wanted was for me to be his sister, to have Mother greet him as her long-lost son. We each tried to tell him it wasn't so, but he thought we were lying, trying to shun him. She paused to sip her tea. As we talked and stormed down there on the beach, the truth of the error leapt out of the dark, stopping my breath with its simplicity. Rose wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. If only, she said, if only I'd known the secret that Auntie Em carried, and if only I had seen the letter that had been addressed to me. I didn't know the letter was yours, I said. I was trying to find out quietly so as not to alarm anyone. Yes, I know, said Rose. Just that if I'd been home to collect the post, there might have been a happy ending. Instead, Leonard did terrible things, far past forgiveness. One mistake piled on the next until he could see no way out. The way he shook me when I tried to explain what I just guessed. Her fingers strayed to her shoulders where Leonard's fury had left its mark. "But how did it all start?" said Granny. Her ball of wool rolled off her knee and across the floor. Hector and I both pounced, but Hector won and wound it before handing it back. "Leonard's mother, Mrs. Cable, preferred him not to know that he was adopted," said Rose, "nor about the allowance. She was afraid he would feel unloved knowing he'd been given away, or imagine that she cared only because she was paid to do so." "A shocking thing to learn when he was grown," said Mummy, "that he was not who he believed himself to be." "When Mrs. Cable died," said Rose, "her husband finally told the whole story. After that, Leonard could not rest. Snooping through papers, he identified my father as the source of the allowance. From that moment, he burned to meet the man he guessed to be his father." Rose sipped her tea. I knew it must be cold by now and poured more fresh from the pot under the crocheted cozy. "Mr. Cable received a letter from the solicitor announcing my father's death and enclosing a small legacy of £30. That £30 set Leonard off, a hint of what else might belong to him, and enough to pay for his travels to find out. He soon said goodbye to the Cable farm and made his way to Torquay." Rose closed her eyes and rested her head against the back of the chair. "After many weeks in Torquay," said Hector, "Leonard is finding the courage. He stops Mrs. Eversham beside the post office. With much longing he tells her, 'I am your son,' and she rebuffs him." "She called him filth," said Rose, "and did not even tell him the truth. I assume because she preferred to keep hidden any hint of scandal that would tarnish the Eversham name." "And on Friday evening," said Hector very quietly, "your mother is again making the threat, is she not?" "Leonard delivered the flowers for the concert," I said. "He was standing right there when you and your mother came through the door." "She must have recognized him," said Rose. She said that any young man who dared to approach her daughter would be imprisoned on a charge of attempting to assault her." "I thought she was being mean to Roddy Fusswell," I said. "So did we all," said Rose. "It was so embarrassing." "Instead, she was warning Leonard," said Hector, "reminding him that she means to do him harm." "And again the next morning?" I said, remembering Miss Marianne's description of the minutes before the murder. "When Mrs. Eversham read the letter, she wanted to go straight to the police. Her threat was her own death sentence." "Poor Auntie Em," said Rose. "If only he'd said those words to her. She would have a son and I a cousin, without prison bars between us." "Mrs. Cable died," I said. "He must have missed her. And he was not content on the farm. He was looking for a new family. But he ended up sleeping in a cold shed in a stranger's garden, looking up at the warm pink lights of the window where he believed his sister to be sleeping. That might make a person lose his reason, mightn't it?" "It is not perhaps only a matter of money," said Hector. "Being without a home, it is very difficult, the wishing to belong somewhere." Tears scalded my eyes. When I blinked them away, I saw that everyone else was pink-eyed too. Tony rested his nose on Hector's knee. My sorrow was for Rose being an orphan, for Miss Marianne for losing so much, for Hector being far from his family, and for Papa, who I would never see again. "Hector, dear," said Marjorie. "Madame, when does your family expect to make the journey from Belgium?" "They hope to come in the spring, Madame." "I wonder whether you would consider spending Christmas with all of us at Owl Park. It will be my first holiday as mistress there, and I intend to make it awfully jolly. We have a skating pond and a wonderful cook and a fireplace in every room. What do you think?" I clapped my hands. "Oh, do say yes, Hector!" Hector appeared to be speechless. He gazed at Marjorie with something that looked like adoration. "Yes," he said, "I will very much like to come." Marjorie laughed and shook his offered hand. "Well then, it's settled. You shall have an old-fashioned English Yuletide and roasted chestnuts and carol singers and figgy pudding. And I promise there will be no dead bodies unless poor old Father Christmas drinks too much eggnog and knocks himself stupid on the hearth." "Do not make such a promise," I said. "Bodies can show up anywhere." The end. How about that? Good ending, right? Good ending. And now off to bed I go.